everybody. I hope that you are able to see my slides this time. Welcome to the third session of Signum Academy's Narnia camp. I am back at home in a safe Wi-Fi full place, so I hope that today's broadcast goes better than last time's. I am looking forward to walking through one chapter of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe today with you all. We're just going to be looking at chapter 5 because there are some really interesting moments in it. So I'm going to check to make sure that I can switch through slides. So let's see. Yes, this is looking better. All right. Okay, so going back to oops, what happened now? Yeah, okay. Well, we'll just have to do it this way. Okay, so today we are talking about the logic of trust, as it plays a pretty big role in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We'll be looking at Peter, Susan, and Edmund's responses to Lucy as she is excited that Edmund has joined her in Narnia, and now they're back and trying to figure out whether to believe Lucy or not. And we're also going to be more introduced to the character of the professor, who has a background role, but also a pretty important one. So without further ado, let's get into Peter and Susan. So how do the oldest children, Peter and Susan, respond to Lucy's Narnian adventures? Let's read what we have here. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. So Lucy has come in and she's really excited that Edmund has come to Narnia with her. She expects that now people will believe her because Edmund will, of course, say, hey, I've been to Narnia. Lucy's right? Well, let's keep reading. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. Tell us, Ed, said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really. Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. So, here Lucy's expectations are all built up that Edmund is going to back her story, say, yes, we've been to Narnia, I've eaten Turkish delight there, I've spoken to the Queen, and Lucy was with Mr. Tumnus the Fawn. But Edmund has been getting worse and worse throughout this story. He has first talked to let's see where we are. See? Oh, okay. He has talked to the witch and eaten her food, which, if you are at all familiar with the way magic worlds work, you should never eat food in another world presented by a queen, unless you know that that queen is very nice, and we know that this queen was not very nice. So Edmund has entered the world already with a rotten attitude, which has wrecked his experience in that world, unlike Lucy's experience. Let me plug my computer back in. All right, so then we have Edmund in a worse situation than when we found him, which wasn't a good situation to begin with. So he comes back with Lucy, and his one goal, like we talked a little bit about yesterday, was to be older than Lucy, to be more superior to everybody. He doesn't like who he is and what position he's in. So his one objective is to put the people around him down in order to lift himself up. And so that's exactly what he does here. He pretends, or he lies that what he experienced in Narnia was just pretend. So he's turning what is supposedly a pretend world into really a pretend world, when in reality it's real. So he's playing around with meeting the new thing, and he's denying that he has met the new thing in order to make his own reality more the way he wants it to be, rather than the way it should be because of what's happening. All right, so Edmund is beastly. This has been said of him many times. Well, it will be said of him many times throughout this chapter. He is spiteful and beastly. These two words get used of him a lot. Something that's really interesting in this story is how there are characters who are open and honest, and there are characters who are slithering around the truth in order to try to get their way. So if we've been comparing Lucy and Edmund, let's think about Lucy. Has she been open with herself, with her siblings, with Mr. Tumnus? Yes, she's been honest with them. She's been frank with them, and she's been kind to them. And she lets the world be as it is, and she takes what comes to her because she's being open back to the world. Edmund, on the other hand, does not have that open and kind outlook on life. He, again, has only one goal: to be better than everybody else, and he's willing to do the wrong thing to get that goal. So he is willing to lie, as we just saw, and he's willing to be mean, as we just saw. So when it comes to interacting with the wonderful new world that Narnia is, he's turning it into something awful because of what he's willing to do in order to get his way. And that's something important to keep in mind as we keep going through the story. Are we dealing with an open and kind character, or are we dealing with someone who has a nasty goal and is willing to be nasty to get it? All right, so that seems to be one of the ways that you could divide up the characters of the book. And for me, that's really interesting to make me ask, how am I dealing with the world that I've been given? Am I being open and kind and honest, or am I being mean and spiteful in order to get to a goal that maybe I shouldn't even be getting to? So let's keep going. What happens next? Beastly. Okay. Even though Peter and Susan don't really believe that Lucy's world is real, they don't like the way that Edmund is treating her. So we'll see that. "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next?" I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." So there is a lot in this passage going on. Peter, we get to see his character a little bit more. He's going to try to stand up for what is right, in the sense that how Edmund is treating Lucy is wrong, and he's willing to call that out and say, "Hey, Edmund, you're being mean. There's no reason to be treating Lucy like this, even though we don't believe what she's saying. So that is a good example to us about how to deal with someone even we don't agree with, or someone that we're not sure about yet. Peter says that even though he doesn't believe her, that Edmund's way of treating her isn't the right way, of making her little, diminishing or minimizing her is one way that we can put it, and just playing with her to make her feel bad, just jeering and nagging, as Peter says. So Edmund doesn't even have a good excuse for that. He is trying to get around the issue of how he deals with people. But Peter, again, he likes to explain the situation and help direct the crowd in an older brotherly sort of way. And so he knows his little brother, and he says, you've been treating anyone smaller than yourself in this mean way, over and over again at school and at home. So Peter doesn't let Edmund's bad behavior slide. He is clear with Edmund about it, and that's an example of the kind of openness that is important in the world of Narnia. We'll see that more as the story goes on, but at the beginning, I want us to be noticing some certain character traits that are important to be able to deal with Narnia well. We've seen Lucy's openness and honesty, even when it's a little scary, right? She is kind to Mr. Tumnus, even though she doesn't know who he is. But when we get further in the story, when Lucy's at Mr. Tumnus's cave and he's telling her that he is supposed to kidnap her, I don't know if you remember or not, but Lucy says, Mr. Tumnus, you cannot kidnap me. You can't do this. It's not right. So being able to distinguish between what is right and wrong in an unknown situation and being open enough to say what is right and wrong and act on it, though, that's a very important characteristic for dealing with Narnia successfully. So we've seen Lucy portray those characteristics, and now we're beginning to see Peter show that character quality, even though he hasn't actually seen Narnia. Edmund, again, on the other hand, is not able to deal with the world that is his real world well, and so he's not dealing with Narnia very well. He's not dealing with the new thing very well. He's being secretive, and he's lying in order to make himself feel superior at everyone else's expense, rather than dealing with reality as it is. Now, dealing with reality as it is the theme of this chapter, because as we'll see, the children are very worried about Lucy. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Lucy, of course, doesn't feel very good right now because Edmund has basically thrown her under the bus. He hasn't been honest with his older siblings, so nobody believes Narnia at just the moment when Lucy thought they would start believing that Narnia is real. So she's been let down. It's been a huge letdown. And she bursts out, I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts, beasts. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. All right, so here we see that Lucy, again, is willing to stand up for what she believes in. She has found that Narnia is real, and she's not going to back down on that, even though it would make her life easier to say, oh yeah, Edmund's right, we were just pretending. But Lucy's not willing to do that. Is that making her life hard? Yeah. She feels betrayed by her siblings, especially Edmund. Does she have an outburst here? Yes. So she's very emotionally invested in the fact that Narnia is real, and her siblings are not paying attention to that, not caring, particularly Edmund. However, um, C.S. Lewis gives us a little picture of how the other three siblings are dealing with Lucy's pain. Edmund is not really feeling remorse, but he's noticing that his plan isn't going as he thought it would. Now, what was his plan? We've been able to piece together so far that Edmund's one plan is to make sure that he is seen as better and the biggest and in charge and in control, and the others around him is he wants them to be seen as littler than he is. So he has a very big ego, and he's selfish. He's self-centered. He only cares about himself, and he's willing to, again, lie in order to be seen as different than what he is. So that's not really working out for him, though, because where he expected his older siblings to be like, oh, Edmund, you're so smart, you're just playing with her, and all that, they are instead getting rather upset because Edmund has been toying with Lucy's feelings in ways that are unkind, and Peter, even though he doesn't believe in Narnia, is not letting Edmund do the wrong thing without suffering the consequences. So, that is so far for Edmund. For Peter and Susan, they have even more mature concerns in mind. They're trying to see Lucy's situation and think, why is my sister believing in another world? I don't know about you, but if my little brother came up to me and said, I found another world, I probably, as much as I love Narnia, would be a little concerned. So that is exactly how Peter and Susan are feeling. They think that Lucy might be going crazy, that she's out of her mind. And instead of making fun of her and bullying her, they are instead trying to figure out how to help her. So we've seen a contrast between Edmund and Lucy. So now let's think about the contrast between Edmund and Peter and Susan. Now, these three kids, Edmund, Susan, and Peter, none of them supposedly believe in Narnia. Edmund has to because he's been there, but he doesn't want to let on that he believes in Narnia. The two older ones don't believe in Narnia at all. However, Edmund responds unkindly to Lucy's position, whereas Peter and Susan respond kindly, even though they don't believe in Narnia. They're responding with a desire to help and make Lucy's life easier and better. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. A good lesson to learn, I think, that there are a lot of different ways to respond to a difficult situation, and there's always a kind way to respond to a difficult or uncertain situation. And Peter and Susan are a pretty good example of that in this chapter. But let's go back to our theme about reality and logic and trust for this chapter. Peter and Susan think that Lucy is going crazy. Peter earlier on suggested that she might be lying, so that's another possibility. But either way, they have already taken for granted that Narnia is not true because it doesn't fit with what they have believed about life so far. And they're willing to think that Lucy is crazy or a liar in order to hold on to the fact that Narnia can't be real. So they, trying to help out of a desire to help Lucy, are going to seek some help. Let's see. So the passage goes on to say, the result of their whispering in the hall when Lucy went to bed was that the next morning, they, Peter and Susan, decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou, said Peter. It's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. All right, so let's keep contrasting Peter and Susan to Edmund's behavior towards Lucy. As we've seen, Edmund is self-centered and is willing to hurt other people in order to get his own way and be seen as the oldest or the one in charge. Peter, however, is kind of already in the in-charge position, right? He's the oldest, and he has shown himself to be someone who tries to look out for his younger siblings. But he's not willing to risk the well-being of his younger siblings just to be seen as a know-it-all, like Edmund is. Edmund is willing to do anything to be seen as the person who knows it all. Peter, however, is humble enough to ask for help. He says the situation is getting beyond them, and Susan agrees. So that's another important thing when we're dealing with something that is unknown, to be willing to ask for help and to know who to ask help from. So here we go. Peter goes to the professor with Susan. And we'll go to the next slide to talk about the professor a little. Now, this is a concept art of what the professor's house could have looked like. It is a huge house, as we have seen. We talked about it having lots of books and all this. So the professor is a pretty retreated man, but he seems to be kind, right? Because he's taking these children in. So we see a kind, welcoming person in this house, but also the house is a little imposing, right? The professor might be a bit of an imposing character. He has shaggy white hair and probably has some quirks, and he could come across as a little scary. And he's definitely new to the four children still. Even though they're living in his house now, he's not their parents, and where they are is not London, which is their home. So we see Peter and Susan going along the same path that Lucy did before entering the wardrobe. Peter and Susan are having to deal with new and strange things in their own world already, and they're willing to get over some of their shyness and some of their fears in order to do the right thing. Peter and Susan are willing to admit that they don't know everything and approach the potentially scary professor in order to do the kind and loving thing and help Lucy. So here we go. They're in this big house and they're going to meet the professor. All right, so Peter and Susan explain the situation and think that maybe Lucy is lying or is going crazy. So the professor responds with some interesting ideas. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they had only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing about it," said Peter. "Up till now, I'd have said Lucy every time." So what are we going to do with this? "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That is more than I know," said the professor. "And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed." All right, so here is a picture of the professor. While I'm talking, I'd love if any of you want to type in some of your thoughts about the professor. He is quite an interesting character. If you know the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia, don't we're not going to be addressing questions that spoil the character for those who don't know who the professor is yet. And if you want to talk more about that, feel free to email me. But for now, we're just going to talk about the professor in this story itself. So the professor gives some very logical, simple advice, which is believe the person who is truthful. That's a reason why character is so important in this story. Lucy has, before the story even started, proven to be a person of good character. She has been honest and open. So all of the characteristics we're seeing in Lucy right now are things that she has been showing from long before this story began, and that softens the children towards believing Narnia, right? Because if Lucy is truthful, then why would she start lying right now, even if it's something that they don't think they could believe? So this is something that's very characteristic of C.S. Lewis. We see this in his other writings too, if you ever get around to reading them, that what is true and what is good often comes before what you think originally is real. So you let yourself believe what is true and good before just living by what you see. So even though, or have been told to believe. So even though Peter and Susan assume that Narnia can't be real, the professor, who, let's think, is a grown-up, right? And being grown-up has already been an important part of the story. So the one grown-up in this story so far has suggested that Narnia could be real, because it's more likely that Narnia is real than that someone who is good and true would tell a lie, right? So we have to at least consider the possibility that Lucy is telling the truth, because mistrusting someone who has given no reason to be doubted is, as the professor says, a very, very serious thing. So that changes the way, at least I hope it does, changes the way we act and the way that we treat and see others, right? If Lucy's character is so good and so strong that it could help make the professor think that Narnia is real, then how could our characters, being good and strong, courageous and kind like we've seen Lucy be so far, how could that strength of character affect the world around us for good, and welcome others into seeing beautiful things like Narnia because of our strong characters? So I think that's something that C.S. Lewis would want us to notice, that who we are is a really important part of the way that we can be kind to other people and help other people enjoy the world. So all of this, the professor is noticing. And so based on what is true and good, the professor is asking Peter and Susan, the children, to reconsider what they think has to be real. So we see that reality is getting a bit of a do-over for these children. So that leads us to the next slide. The conversation between the professor and Peter and Susan continues. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, Why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go to the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor, and Peter did not know quite what to say. Ah, I see that Bella has made a comment about the professor. Yes, you're right, Bella. I'm not going to be able to tell that to the rest of the audience, but hopefully that'll be a teaser for them to read the other stories. So good note, Bella. You're very right. So he knows what's going on, doesn't he? All right. So here we are. This professor is telling the children to really reconsider what they think is real. Susan at first thinks that he might be making fun of them, right? Because sometimes grown-ups tease children for what they're willing to believe. But she realizes that the professor is the one maybe believing that Narnia is real when the children won't. So that seems a little bit topsy-turvy, right? But here we are. The professor is willing to believe that Narnia is real. So that's making Susan rethink what she believes is real based on some pretty sound logic. Because if there are only 3 possibilities and 2 of them aren't really possibilities, then you kind of have to believe the other possibility, right? So Peter then comes with an argument that if things are real, they're real all the time. And instead of arguing back, the professor just asks a question. Are they? Are things that are really real there all the time? And one of the questions we could ask is, what does the professor mean by the things being there? Does being there mean that you can always see them, that you can always touch them, or that they're always real? So you should probably think about that. What do you and talk with your camp leaders? What do you think being real means? Is it something? Is a real thing something you can always touch, or is it something that's always there and real, no matter what you can see? So that's a question that is left for Peter. So both Peter and Susan have been challenged by the logic of the professor, and he's the grown-up, and he has been kind to them. So the professor and Lucy are kind of in the same situation where they have both been kind and proven trustworthy, and they both seem willing to believe in Narnia. Now that would be a hard one, wouldn't it be, if you were Peter and Susan? So let's see what keeps happening. Oops. But do you mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place just around the corner, like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach them at these schools. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he. And that was the end of that conversation. All right, so we come into this conversation, or at least Peter and Susan do, looking for a solution about how to fix Lucy. And basically what the professor has said is, you know what, she might not need fixing at all, and we're all just supposed to mind our own business and be kind to one another and continue to be trustworthy with one another. So that's a new thought for Peter and Susan, and it's one they decide to try out. All right, so let's see what the something I want to highlight from the conversation that happened. So, but then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. So this is a snippet of the conversation that they had in the professor's study, in which the professor, as we've seen, has told the children, Peter and Susan, that believing in Narnia might not be as crazy as they think, that Narnia might be real. And Susan has this thought. She never thought that she'd hear a grown-up say something like that, believe in another world, believe in something beyond what can be touched and seen and felt and heard. And Susan doesn't know what to think. But the professor has given both Peter and Susan a new and open and honest approach to life. That if something is logically necessary, it's worth believing in, even if you can't sense it. So Peter and Susan are having to rethink what they believe fundamentally about this world in order to try to deal with Lucy in a kind way. And this also is addressing a problem that Susan has thought through a lot. She's a very practical person. She, as we have seen, helps Peter take care of the 4 siblings, and she goes very much on what she can understand and sense. And so when she hears a grown-up who supposedly are the most practical people in the world, right? When she hears a grown-up, the professor, potentially believing in Narnia, which for the most part doesn't seem practical at all, apart from the logic of it, that makes Susan have to sit back and rethink what being a grown-up really is. Is being a grown-up being the most on top of it, pragmatic, fixer kind of person? Or is being a grown-up being someone who can see facts and deal with them in real ways, in logical ways, in trustworthy ways, and good ways that might not be what everybody else in the world is saying? Because the professor believing in Narnia, I mean, what do you think would happen if the professor's neighbors heard that the professor believed in Narnia? That they probably would not take to that very well. But the professor has a belief that potentially believing in Narnia is a necessary thing to do based on truth and goodness. So we'll see what happens with that. Of course, we as a reader already know that Narnia is real. So the professor is the only one saying what is right so far, because Narnia is real. We don't expect the grown-ups or the logical people in our lives to believe in other worlds or believe in things that are different and new, or at least new to us. But sometimes we have to rethink some of the things that we believe in the world based on what is true and what is good. And that's exactly what's happening in this chapter. And that's only possible because we see Lucy and the professor and Peter and Susan trying to be kind and courageous and honest with one another. So those are some character traits that really stand out in this chapter and will be standing out throughout the rest of the book. And I think that they're character traits that are important for us to learn from and incorporate into our own lives. And so because of the way those character traits play out, the adventure gets to really begin, right? And after that, so after that very important conversation with the professor, whether it was that they lost their heads or that Mrs. McCready was trying to catch them or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. None will follow us in there." Okay, so we've just walked through this conversation with the professor in which the professor suggests that Narnia might probably have to be real, based on the way that Lucy has talked about it and based on what the children know of Lucy from the past. And now, in the story, the 4 children are in the situation where they have to get away from the housekeeper, who is showing some tourists, or trippers, as Susan calls them, the housekeeper is showing them the house, because remember, it's a big old country manor that lots of people want to come and see. So the 4 children are trying to run away and hide from the housekeeper so the housekeeper can do her thing. And the housekeeper, Mrs. Macready, keeps following them until Susan suggests, oh, we should go to the wardrobe room because nobody's going to go in there. Mrs. Macready's not going to take the tourists into the wardrobe room. But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All 4 of them bundled inside it and sat there, panting, in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for, of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. All right, so let's back up a little bit in this passage and go to that first sentence, that whether it was they lost their heads, or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere. So for some reason, and Lewis gives us a few potential explanations, but we know which one is the real one, right? Because we've been to Narnia before in this book. That somehow, some way, the 4 children have been chased into the wardrobe, and it's their choice to get into the wardrobe. They're responding to what's happening in the house, that Mrs. Macready is leading these tourists around. They choose to go into the wardrobe, but they're also chased into the wardrobe. And Peter is leading the pack into this wardrobe, and it's a question of reality again, which we've been dealing with this whole chapter. That why are they in the wardrobe? Do you think that there was any other way that the 4 children would have gotten into the wardrobe? Probably not, because they've all been avoiding the wardrobe for Lucy's sake, right? Lucy has been very down because of the way Edmund has treated her, and that nobody believes in Narnia, but she knows it's real. So of course, Peter and Susan, listening to the professor, have decided to let that slide and just everyone mind their own business. So they've been avoiding the wardrobe until one day they are chased into the wardrobe. Do you think that it was some magic in the house that had come to life? I'd love to hear what you think is pushing them into the wardrobe. Do you think it's a Narnian magic, or do you think it's a practical reality? Do you think it's their own decision? You can talk about that more with your camp organizers, because I think there are some really interesting ideas to be found there. But I think that in this sentence, we're seeing how the magic of Narnia comes into everyday life, and everyday life comes into the magic of Narnia. So, sure, we know that Narnia is real, and that the magic of Narnia could easily be pushing them into the wardrobe. Yeah, we agree with that because we know that Narnia exists. But does that mean that the children aren't nervous and are hiding and running away from Mrs. Macready? Does that mean that they haven't lost their heads? No, they are nervous and running away from Mrs. Macready. The fact that it's Narnian magic doesn't mean that they're not nervous. Also, do you think Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them? She was probably trying to get them out of her way. But just because it's Narnian magic doesn't mean that that possibility isn't real either. So sometimes I think when we're dealing with the wonder of a new world, or a new idea, or a new situation, there are a lot of different explanations to why you end up in the wardrobe. But it all has to do with Narnian magic, right? In this story, the magic of Narnia doesn't cancel out the realities of life. It helps explain it, but it doesn't mean that the realities of life aren't real. So when we're dealing with meeting wonder in our own lives, the fact that there are practical things in this world doesn't cancel out the Narnian magic in our own lives, but the Narnian magic can help explain it. So that's how they end up in the wardrobe. And I'd love for you to think about what the Narnian magic in your own lives is, because this is a story that Lewis wrote to share some pretty important ideas that he had that he thought were real in our own lives. So it would be an interesting thought experiment to think about what could be the Narnian magic in your own life. What is the thing calling you from one place to another, if there's anything? And does that cancel out the practicalities of your own life, the realities of your own life, or does it help explain the realities of your own life? Like it's helping to explain the real practical situation that these 4 children find themselves in. All right, we're going, oh yes, yep, good job, Bella. Yeah, I think that the magic of Narnia is drawing them in too. So as we will see in the next chapter, so before getting there, our time is getting a little short and I'll end a little bit early today. But I want to point out that they're in the wardrobe. So that's obviously setting us up for a grand adventure next time we have a session. But look at Peter. He remembered that you never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. All right, so Lucy and Peter are again having a similar approach to Narnia. They're on top of the situation and they're not going to get stuck in the wardrobe. Edmund, on the other hand, he got stuck in the wardrobe because he forgot to keep the door open, right? So let's see how those comparison and contrasts keep playing out in Narnia next time. For now, why don't we think about the characters that we've seen in this chapter so far? I think there are a few activities. If your camp organizer is choosing to do the prompts and activities in the camp packet, you'll be able to think more about the characters of Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, and the professor in this chapter. And apart from that, just think about how the different children and the professor's characters are influencing what they do and what they believe, both for themselves and towards each other, and how that affects Narnia and how the children get into Narnia. So this is the beginning of a new section in the book and the end of an old section in the book. So the first section of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe kind of stops here, where we've had a lot of introduction for the first 5 chapters. We have the characters of each child pretty well laid out for us, and we've seen the beginnings of how those characters interact with one another and with Narnia. So today is a good day or this time before you see the next session, is a good time to stop and think really hard about the different characters we've seen so far, because that's going to be the foundation for the rest of the story. And think about how those characters relate to Narnia, because obviously we're going to be seeing more of Narnia next time. All right. So here's one question that I want you to think about if you have time. How did the professor's advice help the 4 children, and why did it help? While I'm wrapping up, feel free to put in your thoughts in the question box, or feel free to email me about the professor especially, and about anything you notice in the characters of the 4 children. And you can do that here. So here are a few announcements before we go. First, a Again, you can email me at academy@signumu.org, and I'll respond to any of your questions or thoughts. And this is both for anyone attending as a learner, but also if camp organizers have any questions about where I'm going or suggestions or thoughts, I'd be happy to hear from you all too. Something that we at Signum Academy would love is to hear from you, especially camp organizers, about how you are doing the Narnia camp, how many children are coming. That's especially something we want to know, how many learners are in your camp or co-op, and anything that you've found helpful in the course packet or things that you think we could change in the course packet. We're open to suggestions, and we'd love to know how you're best helping the learners who are coming to you. And then, of course, in general, if you want to know more about Signum, that puts out Signum Academy, feel free to check out our website at signumuniversity.org. That'll have more information about who we are as a university, what we do with our MA program and with our public programming, and then with other parts of Signum Academy, the other camps we have, etc. So those are our announcements. Tune in next time. We have a bit of a teaser picture here. The four children discover an adventure, and we'll talk about that next time in session 4, hopefully. So I hope that you all have a good day or a good week or however long it is until we meet back next time for this session. And I hope you enjoy discussing everything we have talked about so far. You guys have a great time. All right, take care. Bye.